Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by Jan Capps. She is the author of Bird's Eye View. This book is about when her and her young daughter moved to Guatemala to run a medical clinic and the things that happened to them while they were there. This promises to be a very interesting story because I'm always fascinated by people that go and do crazy and unconventional sorts of things and then write about them. This project reminds me of a guest we had on several months ago, um, who ended up leaving his real estate job in Chicago to move because he found the love of his life in Lima, Peru. So
Mm.
this sounds like it's going to be another one of those fun tales like that. So welcome, Jan, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So why don't we start from the very beginning? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the book?
Yeah, thanks. So I have been working with in the field of public health for over 30 years, in all sorts of different projects ranging from helping farm workers to domestic violence advocates to health equity. Um, I really got my bearings about 25 years ago when I was kind of early in my public health career, and I went to Guatemala for 2 years, which was right after the peace accords had signed there after a 35-year war. And I went in part because I had been working with immigrants in the US, and I wanted to better understand the conditions in which people lived and why people choose to immigrate and how I could better support immigrants in the US, um, which did happen, but it also just really changed my worldview and my perspective on how I worked and lived and what kind of friend I was and what kind of, you know, citizen I was. Mainly because I just fell in love with the country of Guatemala and I fell in love with the people. And so I was a young single woman back then. And then a few years later, I met a wonderful man, started a family with him, and I had just had the notion of moving back to Latin America and sharing that experience with my family, and in particular, sharing something that I loved and something that had moved me and touched me so much as a young woman with my daughter. And my husband and I planned many years for this trip. And just before we were getting ready to go, he bailed on the trip and then he bailed on the marriage. And
Oh
then
no.
exactly. So this was years of work and it was, life was completely turned upside down. But then I kind of regrouped over the next year and a half and realized that this is something I still wanted to do. And I looked one day and one website found one job, applied and got it, which was to manage this clinic in Guatemala. It was in a different part of the country than I had lived before, but it was um, doing something somewhat similar. And I negotiated with her dad, my daughter's father, about this and came to an agreement with him and then moved with her. So we moved to a little village on Lake Atitlan in the highlands of Guatemala and lived there for a year. And so the book um, is largely set in that year in which we were in Guatemala, but there's also a lot of flashbacks to the time I had lived in Guatemala before, and then also in my life in general. I think um, what is kind of unique about this book is it's not just my story, but it's the story of the people that I met in Guatemala and the culture and the history, and there's a lot of Maya mythology in it. Um, when I was in Guatemala this second time, I was living in an indigenous Maya village, and I speak Spanish fluently. My daughter speaks Spanish fluently, but we don't speak Maya. And so I was studying the language there. And what I learned was the word for computer actually means the weaver of words in that language. And I had been trying to write out my story and sort of trying to make sense of what had happened in my marriage and in my life. And when then I thought of this computer, like this, thing I touch every day, as not something to compute, but as something that could help me weave together words. I started weaving together the stories of the particularly the women that I knew, and my story, and like I said, Guatemala mythology, Maya mythology into it. So, one of the things that my teacher had told me, my Suta Hill teacher, was that, um, as people, we inherit, from our parents, not just genes and blood, but we also inherit memories and their experiences and their past. And so to understand your present self, you have to understand the past. And so this story also looks a lot into my past, but also into history in general to be able to understand my present.
Wow. I wasn't wrong when I said it was going to be interesting and wide ranging. Good, good,
Yeah.
good. So, um, give us, I think a lot of people, most Americans could not find Guatemala on a map with a gun to their head. Um, give us a sense of the country. What is it? Because I think most people, when you think of it, everyone kind of thinks, very poor, mud huts, a couple
Mhm.
trucks, that sort of, second, third world type of thing. Give us a little sense of Guatemala.
Yeah, so on the map, it is just south of Mexico, and to the west of Belize. So it borders Mexico, Belize, El Salvador, um, and so it's. I'm trying to think of like what to say in sort of the square mile area. Um, it's probably about the size of North Carolina, which is what I'm in right now. That size,
Yeah,
but
it's not a terribly large country. It's not
it's
like,
not a big country, but it has 13 million
it's not
people.
Luxembourg, but it's not very large.
Exactly. It's not Liechtenstein, but yeah, it's a small country, but it's divided into 22, 23 departments. There's 23 different ethnic groups within Guatemala. 21 of them are indigenous. One is the Garifuna people, which are kind of mixed, indigenous and African ancestry. And then they're the Spanish speaking Latinos. So it's a very diverse country. There, half the people, at least half the people are indigenous Maya and speak one of the Maya dialects or languages at home.
Yes. One of
Yeah.
the uh things that I think people don't forget what has been part of the migrant crisis, especially with the child separation policy, and they were sending 3-year-olds to immigration court, which was just silly, inhumane, but also dumb, is that the kids had not yet been to school and only spoke their native language and hadn't learned Spanish yet, which caused all types of problems to get translation to even find out where these children came from. So it's like all of a sudden you need,
Yeah.
all these people who speak these really small native dialects that almost no one
Yeah.
speaks, all this type of thing. And so I think it's interesting because I think we think, oh, it's another former Spanish colony. They must all speak Spanish there. And that is not true for Guatemala,
Well, the United
necessarily.
States is also a former Spanish colony, and not all of us speak Spanish.
Right. Yes. No. It's funny.
Right.
It's so funny you mentioned that.
It's a very
My
diverse country.
Yeah,
Right.
my dear friend Brady, who's appeared on this podcast, her mother's people were indigenous to the Southwest United States, and they were part indigenous, part Spanish from the conquistadors in southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley. And so their
Yeah.
family has been there since the 1500s. And the old family joke goes, we woke up one day and we're part of America. The border didn't
Yeah.
move. We didn't move, the border moved to us, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so our family woke up one day and all of a sudden we're
Yeah.
part of the United
Yeah.
States. So, and that's true for a whole great big chunk of the country, a whole great big chunk of the
Exactly.
country. So
Yeah.
it's yes, no, that's fun. She always talks about that because her grandmother had terrible racial issues and lied for decades and decades and said she was Italian because it was more acceptable to not be
Oh,
Mexican, sort of thing. Yeah, yeah, that quiet racism that goes on. So, but back to you and your book. Enough of my
yeah,
storytelling. Poor,
that's
poor
okay.
my poor listeners hear enough of that on their own. That's an excellent. I did not know about Guatemala and its departments, almost like Switzerland and its cantons. That's very interesting. What was your daily life like in Guatemala? I imagine, I mean, is it, you could have problems in terms of getting fuel, getting water, getting electricity. Like, is it like that sort of difficulty, or is it dealing with the people? What's the daily life like?
Yeah. So I'll answer your question, but I also want to speak to something that you brought up a few minutes ago
Of
about
course.
immigration and children. So let me answer your question first. Um, so in the experience that I had with my daughter, so the year that I lived there, we basically lived in a cinder block house on a pile of rocks. And there was a path through the rocks up to our house, or we could cut through someone else's house to get there. Um, we had water outside the main structure of the house. So there was a big sink called a pila, which is where you wash your dishes and wash your clothes and everything. And it's just outside of the house. Um, we had electricity um, most of the time, and we were one of the few households that actually had internet access. So, because it is an area where there's a lot of tourists, there's a fair amount of infrastructure. And so, in the clinic where I worked, we also had, electricity and running water. We didn't have a lot of the types of medical equipment that might be accessible in the States, but we tried to make do with what we had. There was a lot of improvisation. I know, for example, we also hosted teams from the United States. So there was one team that came down of folks from Texas. And, no offense to Texans, but, Texas is a big state and they were big people, and they donated a lot of their medical scrubs to our staff. And, most Guatemalans are very petite, and they were drowning in these medical scrubs. So I sent them to another organization that is staffed by people with disabilities, and so they converted those medical scrubs into sheets for our tables, because we have exam tables that don't have sheets, so they're all patchwork and stuff. So we just tried to make the best of what we had. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was certainly challenging. What I wanted to speak to that you brought up earlier about the child in immigration court,
Mhm.
I just want to call out that um, people in Guatemala, it's part of their culture for thousands of years, have been migrating north and south for hunting, for agriculture, for trade. And this has just been part, like the birds from Guatemala migrate to the north and south, so have the people. And so that has just been part of their history. And like you said, lo and behold, one day there's a barrier there, and now we're having to do something we've always done, and there's a barrier. So I found a lot of really challenging times trying to explain to my daughter why were there these barriers. So as an American citizen, we have to leave the country. We have to get our passports renewed every 3 months. Our visas renewed every 3 months, I should say. So you could either do that in Guatemala City, or you could leave the country and get a stamp and come back. So we went to Mexico one weekend to get our visas renewed. And for us going to Mexico, or we could also, I needed to buy a can opener. There was no can opener in my village. I needed to buy towels. There are no towels. So just buying basic provisions. Um, so we were able to walk up to the immigration office. I show my passport. My daughter shows her passport. I pay $10, get a stamp, and we walk across a bridge into Mexico. We spend the day in Mexico. We walk across the bridge back. And so when we're walking across the bridge over the river, I look down and my daughter and I are watching people try to make their way across the river. They have tires that are like strapped together, like, big truck tires trying to float across, or like these other, maybe they've gotten like 10 milk jugs or a bunch of milk jugs. They fill up with water and they strap them together, or like vegetable oil containers, and to make this makeshift raft and float across the river. And so my daughter's like, well, why are they floating across the river and we just pay $10 to walk across? And how do you explain that to a child?
Right.
Um, and I said it's because this is the border between Guatemala and Mexico. Like, what role does the U.S. have or control over that border? I tried to explain that because we're from a country that's big and powerful and lots of money, our country influences the immigration policies and activities of other countries. And it just seems like inherently unjust that I need to buy a can opener, I need to buy towels, I need to do these other things, and I can pay $10 and walk across a bridge, whereas other people who are below us, literally below us, are trying, risking their lives to get across the river with like to get gas, or to just visit their families, or to do whatever. Um, and when it was time to leave the country at the end of our stay, like I said, you have to, every 3 months, you have to either leave the country and get your visa renewed, or go into an immigration office to do that. When it was time to leave the country, I was going to leave like 3 months and 3 weeks after it was time to have. So it was 3 weeks over the time for me to renew. And I just didn't like have time to leave the country to go to Mexico. I didn't have time to go into the city to do that. So I show up at the airport with my daughter. My visa is 3 weeks overdue. So I had to pay a fee. I had to pay $50. And so it took probably 15 minutes. I went to immigration office. I filled out some paperwork at customs. I had to go somewhere else, pay my $50, and then I'm on the plane. If a Guatemalan woman had shown up at a US airport with her child and her visa was 3 weeks overdue, she would have gone to jail or to detention, and the child would have been separated and put somewhere else. I It is really hard to explain to my child, my kid who was 10 years old at the time, why that exists. And it and it and explain in a way where I'm not trying to defend my country, um, but just explain it in a way that someone could understand why, how that could be.
Well, there's that
Um,
whole
yeah.
interplay of power and privilege and otherness and brownness that's kind of all coalescing in that discussion, you know.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
No, I
But
was
just over
mindful
and over and
when I
over
was
again, we
in
were trying to
Europe,
do
they
that.
had the migrant camps along the channel, along the train tracks, tents from people from Syria. And I said it, it's very kind of weird. I'm sitting in a train going 210 kilometers an hour, having a lovely meal in first class, which I didn't intend to go first class. I accidentally booked it. Oh well. And all this type of thing. And there are people who have floated and walked, and they try to walk through the tunnel at night trying to get to Britain. So in France,
Yeah,
trying to get to Britain, all this type of
yeah,
thing. And it's a quite shocking thing. And it gets into all that, those discussions of, power and privilege, and you know, who is granted the ability to have things move, all this type of thing. And who
yeah.
is it? And I love how you talked about their ancestral, migratory patterns from Central America through Mexico up into North America. Um, I think people don't understand. We literally basically did not have a southern border policy till about 1977.
Mhm.
Um, they hired a Vietnam general who should have been retiring to try to go manage that. And what had been a very free-flowing conversation of people constantly moving back and forth in Texas and Arizona and California, all this type of thing, all of a sudden it became this, a hard border sort of thing. That got hardened by the drug war, and as that was kind of ramping up in the 80s, and all this sort of thing. And it really interrupted a whole fluidic lifestyle that, as you talked about, had existed forever, you know,
Yeah,
for a long
yeah,
time. And all of a sudden it's not allowed. It is, I think one of the difficulties in managing that is that it's very hard. You can't move the river. It's very hard to disrupt a natural flow like that. It's
yeah.
very
How do you stop
difficult.
the birds from flying?
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Or yeah, or
Yeah.
yes, or animals migrate, all this type of thing. Um, and it's something where, even economically, Freakonomics proved this, having a hard border actually has increased the number of people who come to the US and stay. So it's actually made the problem worse, not better. It
Because they
is
can't go back and forth.
because they can't go back and forth. Yeah, I mean, it was very common my mother grew up in West Texas. It was extremely common for people to come up to Texas, work for the season, make money, and then go home to their ranch in Mexico. They did not want to stay in happy Texas, and I don't blame them. My mother didn't want to stay there either. She got out. But it was very common, and even still, there's guys will come that will, come up and do that sort of thing. They have a ranch, they have land, they have a family. They're just coming to collect a few $1,000 and then they're going to go home. And
Yeah.
if we had a proper immigration system, we would understand allow it to occur in a good manner. And I mean, economically speaking, it would be very good because we get the labor, they get the money, everybody's happy. And But instead we have, decades of broken policy around this. And I can only imagine, given the push to try to stop migration at Mexico's southern border before it gets
Yeah.
to our border, how, Guatemala is right on the front line of that. And
Yeah.
that I can't imagine the social problems and upheaval and issues in day-to-day life that sort of thing must cause.
Yeah. I mean, my daughter went to several schools. We couldn't quite find the right school situation, but we ultimately settled on the Catholic school in town. And like and the Catholic school was like the most expensive school in town. It was $7 a month. And so the one thing that she had in common with a lot of the kids in her class is they all had their fathers were in the United States.
Hmm.
And so because they all had fathers in the United States, they were able to send money, remittances for the kids to be able to go to the private school, the Catholic
Yeah.
school. Yeah. So
Oh,
I
remittances used to be one-third of Mexico's economy. Mexico's a very second, almost first world country now with manufacturing and everything. But like back in the 90s, one-third of Mexico's economy was remittances from the US. Most of Central America, if we stopped the money flow tomorrow, their whole governments would collapse. That's half their money. So I'm
yeah.
not surprised. Yeah.
So I was in an interesting conversation with the staff. So the staff at the clinic were almost all Suta Maya. There was the physician was not indigenous, but everybody else was.
Mm,
And so this was in 2015. So the fall of 2015, which was during their one of their election cycles.
mm.
Um, and they had one candidate was the ex-wife of the ex-president. She was sort of the center left candidate, and then the right candidate was this guy who Jimmy Morales, who had no political experience, right wing backing, and he was only known because he had a popular TV show. And
Stop
I
us
was
when this
like,
starts to sound familiar, America.
and I said, and he won. And I said that would never happen in my country. I said all of our previous presidents have been either a governor or a senator or maybe a general, but like somebody with no political experience, I can't imagine that happening. And so, again, this was 2015. I was kind of out of touch with what was going on in the US at the time. And one of the staff people said, well, what about, elections in your country right now? What about this guy Trump? Because, and I'm like, what do you mean, what about this guy Trump? Like, what? And one of my colleagues said, oh, yeah, he's the Republican candidate now. And I just couldn't believe him because I hadn't been, I'd been sort of out of touch with what was going on in the US. And the staff said, yeah, he said folks from Mexico are like roaches. And he was explaining what they said. And I couldn't understand that. And so this Pedro, this guy was asking me, like, can you explain why he would say that? Why would he say we're a rapist or we're this? Because from Pedro's perspective, as an indigenous person, he's used to being discriminated against because of his language, not speaking Spanish that great, or because maybe the way his wife dresses because she wears indigenous clothes, or like for these other reasons, but they weren't used to being discriminated against because they are trying to take something from other people. In fact, the discrimination was because the Spanish or the Latinos were trying to take something from them, like trying to move them off their land or take their labor from them or other things. And he just didn't have the framework to understand why would they think we're trying to do something. And he's the one who said to me, like, well, we've been going north and like for hundreds of years. That's just what our people do. Why would they think now that we are trying to take something from them? And again, like I was in a situation where not necessarily that I'm asked to justify something, but at least explain it in a rational way. And I couldn't. I can't explain that in a way that would make sense to somebody who, yeah, hadn't grown up in the US.
No, I find I was in Europe at the tail end of 2015, and I got back right before Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire primaries, and and it was, that every pub in by that time of the trip I was in Britain, every pub conversation was 20
Yes.
people with a dozen questions as to what is going on with your country we don't understand.
I don't understand.
So
Yeah.
Pedro had a lot in common with the British pub scene in southwestern England at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was, it was a very, kind of, worrisome and difficult difficult thing. And I find, I have a lot of international friends and international readers, listeners to this podcast, and I get those questions oftentimes about, like especially one that comes up a lot, trying to explain America's very weird racism system that
Yeah.
doesn't really make sense to anyone else. Kind of had to have grown up here in it to understand it. Um, and and some people, it just beggars belief. They're kind of like, so the whole discrimination is based upon how dark your skin is. Yeah, that's really it. That's really the whole game, sort of thing. And it's like, well, what about if you're from this country or that country? Wouldn't it? No, that does not matter. Like it is all, it's the old fashioned brown paper bag test. Like it really is that superficial, things like that that just, so I totally get that. Have had so many similar conversations as the years
Yeah.
have gone by. And I feel like we have such an outsized influence on the world. One of the burdens slash privileges of international travel is you end up spending a lot of your time trying to explain
The
this country.
unexplainable.
Yeah, the unexplainable, or trying to bring a sense of understanding to people about,
Yeah.
the weird ways this country works, and sometimes the ways in which, and I think we're not necessarily conscious of this, the way we do things has a profound effect on other people, and we don't
Yeah.
necessarily always think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was hard for the folks, that staff to reconcile because the
Of
Americans
course.
that they know are folks associated with the clinic who come down and volunteer and who are teaching the doctors and nurses who are working alongside them. And so the folks they meet, the Americans that they had dealings with day to day were kind and generous people. And so how do they reconcile that with like what they're reading in the papers or seeing on the TV? That it didn't make sense to them. And again,
Yeah.
it was hard to explain.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it is a difficult thing, and it's a conversation I have, constantly through the show and the Cameron Journal and all this type of thing. It's a
Hmm.
very difficult sort of thing, and it is I think a bit discordant, um even within our own borders. I grew up in the middle of the country in Northwest Arkansas and
Hmm.
Colorado. I moved to the coast. I've lived on both of them now, in my 20s and 30s. And a lot of people don't understand kind of how the middle of the country works and the
Yeah.
cultural mores of that and all this type of thing. And sometimes I feel like I'm trying to interpret my own country to my own countrymen, to be kind of like
Yeah.
the, okay, yeah, that works great here in the tri-state area, but that's not okay in Texas. They don't think that way in Tennessee, and I've been to every corner of this country there is to go to and lived in several spots of it. And it's just, yeah, it's very,
Yeah.
very difficult, very hard.
Yeah. It also gave me just living there with a daughter. When I would had lived there as a young single woman, I was able to relate to people in one way, but having a child, it gave me another level of investment and connection in the community. So like going to, school events and trying to help my daughter make friends and getting to know the other parents and trying to deal with the school. Something I was really struck with was just how challenging it was to navigate the bureaucracy or the administration of school there. Um, so like I said, we had to switch schools several times just because it wasn't, for many different reasons, it wasn't the right fit. But in the situation in the last school that seemed to be the best fit, this Catholic school, um, well, in every school, whenever there's a parent meeting, they'll send the parents a note the day before, like the kids have to write it on the board. They'll pass out notes for the parents to say, "Oh, tomorrow there's a all parent meeting at 5 o'clock." And I have a full-time job. So how am I supposed to get off and go with one day's notice? Or there's no after school programs for kids. So you're expected to have somebody at home to take care of the kids. So if you're a single mom working full time, how are you supposed to do that? Um, or like lunch at school, they have these ladies would come in as vendors to sell things that they make, and it would often my kid would get sick, and so I'd go in and like I felt like I was just constantly complaining and constantly like needing this and that, and then finally I was asking the administrator, don't you have a calendar? Like, don't you know when the school closures are? Because there was always a different saint's day and the school would close, or it was just really really hard to navigate. And so I went in like, I don't know if you the phrase, an exigente gringa, like a really demanding gringa, and saying, like, don't you know when you're going to be closed? And don't you know when the events are? Like, can't you tell me? Or like, why don't you tell parents ahead of time? And so he said, well, that's because if we tell people ahead of time, they'll just forget. So people like to get, notice the day before. And I realized, like, as I was kind of losing it with the administrator, this would have been like if, when I was in sixth grade in 1979, my mom went to the cafeteria and said, my child needs a low sodium, gluten free, vegan, kosher diet. Why can't the school provide that? And the look that the cafeteria lady would have given my mother is the same look the administrator gave me. Like, I'm well educated, very middle class. I spoke Spanish fluently, and I couldn't make it work. So, how is somebody who is an immigrant in this country supposed to be able to make it work? It's not about language. I mean, language is one thing, and often I think schools say, oh, as long as we post stuff in other languages, we've done our due diligence. It's like the whole school system was set up for Guatemalan parents, as it should be. Like, this is their system. This is how you pay fees. You have to go to the bank and stand in line to pay your monthly tuition. It works for them, and that's why it's that way. But just thinking about when people come here to this country, all of the things and our systems and policies and admin are set up to benefit Americans, to benefit us. And it's more than just language to make it accessible to other people. And we don't think about it that way. And so it really opened my eyes to think about, I mean, a lot of the work that I do in public health is around policy, systems, and environment change. And it just really helped me think about, like, well, what are the policies and infrastructure that we have that are not accessible, you know? So
Yes,
so having a kid like just sort of opened my eyes to a lot of things.
yeah, no, and I want to ask about some of the public. That's a good kind of breakout point because I wanted to ask about some of the public
Yeah.
health challenges in Guatemala and what does that look like? How does one do public health in these environments,
Yeah.
where, sanitation may not be quite up to modern standards and all this sort of
Yeah.
thing. How does one navigate all of that?
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about sanitation, so there's so many programs. People will send like vitamins and supplements to help kids with malnutrition, and food supplements. There's a probably 60%, I think one study we did, 60% of the kids were malnourished in our communities. And there's a lot of stunting of growth. The what goes in can only, into a child can only help them if you can prevent um, getting sick uh, from water. So a lot of the problems with malnutrition are related to not having potable water. So even if they may have ample food or vitamins, if they don't have potable water, it's all going to go out.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and we didn't have, some households may have running water, but it's not clean. And so one of the things that we were trying to do is helping people get, healthy housing and get better water filtration systems within their homes, or doing education around boiling water and filtering water. So there's certainly a lot of gastrointestinal problems, parasites related to water. Um, Interestingly, I was trying to start in the clinic a well child program, and most folks don't go to the clinic just for sort of healthy well child type of visit. You
They
go
only
if you're
go when
sick.
there's a problem. Yeah.
You only go when there's a problem. Yeah. So I got some forms from actually Washington State's child health form, and we went through it with the staff to see, well, what should be added and what should be deleted. And the things that they thought should be added were information about earthquakes, okay, and bullying. So we added that information. And the things that they thought should be deleted were questions about seatbelts and guns. And so the questions about seatbelts were because a child would never be in a car. So the only car you're ever in is a tuk-tuk, which is kind of a cross between a golf cart and a motorcycle, and they don't have seatbelts. Or if you're in a truck, you're usually in the back of a truck. And then deleting questions about guns, because why would anyone have a gun in the home? It didn't make sense. So what they said,
They should say, oh, we
so
should
what
know
the,
about this country.
so what the
Leading cause
staff
of
said to
child
me,
death under 5.
exactly. So what the
Yes,
staff
yeah.
said to me is the only people who have guns are the police and military. So if you ask about guns in the home, it's just going to confuse people. because why would somebody have a gun in the home? Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting thinking about, what are public health issues in our country versus that. But yeah, certainly lots of issues around gastrointestinal problems with parasites. We also had an issue I write about this, a chapter in my book called Blood on the Floor. I was walking in the clinic one day and I saw blood on the floor, and we're a primary care clinic. Why is that there? And the nurse told me, well, this woman came in who has having a bad aborto. An aborto could be either an abortion or a miscarriage. And this was the third one in a week. And so we were having like this big, you know, epidemic of home abortions because the health center had run out of um, birth control methods a few months before. And so, because there was no birth control methods in the community, we'd run out. Then, lo and behold, within a few months, we're having a lot of people come in with, miscarriages. And women might be going to a local curandera or to someone to get a tea or to get something. And if she miscarries or is trying to do a home abortion and comes into our clinic, there's really nothing we can do. There's nothing there. And the only support would be you'd have to take like a truck to then get a boat across the lake and then take another truck up like into the national hospital to get treatment. It's half a day journey and a lot of money. And it just, again, this was back in 2015, 2016. I didn't know what would have been, I could not have imagined the future in my country.
Now you could do that by just living in Texas.
Right. Yeah.
Or
But
any red state.
right. And so I was really upset that we didn't have enough birth control methods. Like, what's going on? So I found out about this organization that does provide birth control, and they were doing a special education on younger teen pregnancy. So teens ages 11 to 14. They were trying to do more outreach to provide birth control methods to that group. So I went to that organization and went to this meeting about that to like demand that we get more birth control methods. And their training was about really the high incidence of pregnancy among teens in that age, and even 11-year-old girls who are getting pregnant. And they said that in our community, there was a significant number of 11-year-old girls who were getting pregnant. If you do the math back, like, oh my gosh, then they were 10 when they got pregnant. And, there is no such thing as consent when you're that age. It just doesn't exist. And so, these girls are being violated. And these are girls even before, and these are just the girls who's has started menstruating, who could possibly get pregnant. And the organization has expanded the program to offer birth control to them because it would cost the government $200 per delivery. So every time a teen girl gives birth, it costs the government $200. So their solution was, let's just invest more into birth control for these young girls. And then I got upset about, well, why are these young girls getting pregnant? Why are these young girls being violated? And what's the government going to do to protect them? And the organization was like, yeah, I agree with you, but this is what we can do.
Yeah.
And so all we can do is make sure that those tweens have access to birth control. And it absolutely broke my heart because I have, my daughter, the same age, was, safe and secure in our room watching Star Wars movies. And, I never have to worry about the safety and well-being of my kid. But then there are these other children, these young girls, and so my answer in that chapter was like, how much more blood on the floor are we going to have before somebody does something for these girls?
Yeah,
Um, I
that's
think,
which gets
all health,
into cultural issues and toxic
yeah,
masculinity issues. I mean, there's a whole patina of things underlying that harm, you know.
right, right. So all of the health issues in Guatemala, or I should say all large, many of the health issues in Guatemala, as in the United States, are related to the injustices of poverty. So for me, like being materially poor isn't that big of a deal. Like I don't need, a fancy car or a fancy this or that. But like the injustice that is in a society that creates such disparities and such inequities. And those inequities and disparities are the cause behind these health issues. So why don't people have access? Why can't people have sanitation? Why can't people have access to clean water? Why are young girls in threat, of being abused and getting pregnant? Why? And the root causes of this are all about, yeah, injustice. And so, and that, also just with my daughter being there, that's really hard to explain.
Yeah, I think the sad thing about that is there's and well, every time we kind of have these debates and conversations, I always say, we have new and modern ideas on a lot of these topics, and that's a good thing. Let me say at the outset, great, good progress, everybody. Um, it wasn't that long ago that that was the reality for people in this country. It's still the reality for some. My first novel, the plot, is about a young man who kills his stepfather for molesting his sister and his life afterward.
Mm,
Based on a true story someone told me once a very long time ago. And that, that sort of thing. And a lot of other cultures just haven't caught up to that sort of thing, and it just sort of goes on and people sort of turn the other way about it because that's, and it oftentimes it becomes self-reinforcing because the women, that's what happened to them, so it's just kind of expected and it gets passed on generationally. um it's a hard cycle to break. I don't even know how you start on that, because it requires a major cultural shift. It really does.
yeah. I mean, my great grandmother got married when she was 12 and had her first child at 13. So it's not,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
No, I
cross
mean
culture.
my grandma was pregnant with my mother at 16, almost 17, and was married when she was 17, and the entire town considered an excellent match to marry a man 11 years older than her. And in
Mm,
1956 in Eastern Colorado, that was she is considered married well. They owned a business in town. She was, doing very well for herself. Um,
mm,
and the reality is she was an adolescent who was thrown into marriage and motherhood against against her will, against her liking, and without her consent.
yeah.
Um,
But just
and
say
and
that the
that
girls,
wasn't
yeah, but
that
the
long
girls I'm
ago.
talking, yeah,
you
but the girls I'm
know,
talking about, like they're not in marriage or like there is no
no.
consent. No.
No, I mean, but the sad thing is, you still end up in these terrible situations where that can go on even long beforehand, and people still turn the other way.
Yeah.
It's something where culturally that oftentimes gets perpetuated. Over time, and that's really a cultural systemic issue, and poverty
Yeah.
is part of it. But it's also you kind of end up with these systems of the way things are, and it takes someone to come in and interrupt and say, okay, just because it's going on doesn't mean it's good, and we should, do something about that, everyone.
Yeah.
Those conversations can be hard to have, and that social change can be hard to have as well. And I cannot imagine your overwhelm at the presence of that and the realities of that. Um, that's a tough one to swallow. That's why I so honor people like you who go and do this work. I could never.
Oh, I
I
would,
could
yeah.
never, not in a million years, could never ever do this. And I am so honored by people like yourself that go and do this stuff because I would be all
Well, let me just
thumbs.
say, so this book that I wrote, I do not come across as a very sympathetic character. So I don't see what I did necessarily as something to be honored. It was an experience of self-reflection. I learned a lot. Um, I saw, yeah, as I say, I don't come across as a very good character. Um, I wanted to show my daughter something I loved. I wanted her to see, uh, a different reality. I wanted us to live as close to the local population as possible. Like, I earned $500 a month. And when I got a $25 a month raise, I was happy. So I tried to live within my means. Everything had to come out of that $500 a month budget, or just a little bit more. But, when my kid got hurt, I was first in line for the private hospital. So when my kid almost broke her arm, I was able to pay to go across the lake to the private hospital to get an x-ray. When my child got parasites, I availed myself of medication. So it's not something I'm proud of. So it was hard. It's yeah, it's different. And then it's like I can't blame any mother from any country from wanting to do the best for their kid. And at every turn when I wanted to live and share the same experience with Guatemalan mothers, but when my kids' health and well-being and safety was at question, I took advantage of all the privilege that I have to protect my kid. And why wouldn't any other mother do the same?
Yeah. And people walk 2,000 miles for that.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what that's why I always think with immigration. I said, you have to think about the distance. These people walk from months, thousands of miles, to change beds in our hotels, to pick lettuce in California, all this type of thing. And that's an upgrade, harvesting strawberries is a leg up, in the hopes that their children will do better, all this type of thing. It's quite it's quite a perspective shift. Shift. It's we've done good. We've run out the hour. We don't usually only go 45 minutes, but we've done it. We've conversated. So this book is absolutely fascinating. So why don't you tell us where we can buy it and where we can find you online?
Okay, thank you. So you can find me online at jancaps.com. And the book now is available for pre-sale on Amazon. And I'm hoping to get it listed on other sites later. But right now, you could definitely get it on Amazon until it's launched.
Excellent. Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you.